The winters of the 1940s did not forgive weakness. Frost crept under doors, ice formed inside windows, and fuel piles vanished long before spring. Yet in villages cut off from supply lines and cities buried in snow, families endured. Not with abundance, but with ingenuity. These weren't modern conveniences. There were no electric heaters humming in the corner, no trucks delivering coal on schedule. What kept them alive were methods now almost forgotten. Quiet tricks, improvised tools, and materials scavenged from whatever war hadn't taken. A wool curtain nailed across a hallway to trap heat. A brick warmed in the oven and slipped into a bed before nightfall. A way of sealing drafts using nothing but newspaper and paste. They weren't luxury solutions. They were survival, refined over generations, then pushed to their limits during the harshest winters of the century. If these methods vanish completely, we lose more than history. We lose the skills that make cold a challenge instead of a threat. Would you remember them before the frost comes again? Subscribe and hold on to the knowledge that once kept the cold at bay. Number 1. Burnt grain stove boosters. By the third winter of the war, coal was no longer a certainty. Ration tickets could be traded, but supply trains were often delayed or diverted to military use. Families who relied on coal-burning stoves for heat faced a stark choice: make their fuel last longer or face rooms that froze overnight. In farming regions, one resource remained: the byproducts of the harvest. When grain was threshed, husks and chaff were left behind in huge piles. Usually, these were discarded or fed to animals. But in desperate winters, civilians discovered a way to turn them into a form of fuel. The process began with partially burning the husks outdoors in a shallow pit until they were blackened but not turned to ash. This partial charring reduced smoke and made the husks burn slower. Once cooled, the burnt husks were mixed with small amounts of coal dust or wood ash, whatever could be spared, and pressed by hand into dense clumps or bricks. When added to a stove already burning coal or wood, these boosters released steady heat and extended the life of the primary fuel. Even a small handful could stretch a dwindling coal pile by days. In villages where grain husks were plentiful, neighbors shared the work. Children collected the husks, while adults prepared the burn pits and pressing molds. It was dirty, smoky work, but it kept stoves running when no official delivery was in sight. The method had its limits. Husks alone produced less heat than coal, so they couldn't replace it entirely, and improper burning could lead to more smoke, which was wasteful and dangerous in poorly ventilated homes. Still, for those who mastered the balance, burnt grain boosters turned waste into warmth. They also freed families from total dependency on rationed coal, giving them one more layer of security in a winter that offered few guarantees. Today, most of these byproducts are composted, processed, or discarded without a thought. But in the 1940s, they were proof that heat didn't have to come from a store or a supply truck. It could be coaxed from the same fields that fed the family, linking the hearth to the harvest in one continuous cycle. Would you know how to turn waste into warmth? Ooh. Number 2. Oven-dried clay tiles for night heat. In many rural homes during World War II, the bread oven was more than a place to bake. Once the day's loaves were pulled from its stone chamber, the oven still held hours of stored heat. For families living through fuel shortages, that lingering warmth became an opportunity. Instead of letting it fade, they placed clay roofing tiles inside the still hot chamber. These tiles, common in farm buildings, absorbed heat slowly and evenly. After several hours, they were removed with thick cloths or tongs, then wrapped in rags or old blankets. At night, the tiles were slipped between bed covers or placed at the foot of a shared sleeping space. The heat they released kept feet and legs warm deep into the night, reducing the need for extra fuel in the stove. Some families placed them under chairs or benches during long evenings indoors, turning unheated rooms into bearable spaces. This method was efficient because the heat source, the bread oven, was already in use for cooking. No extra wood or coal was burned solely for warmth. In effect, the day's baking fueled the night's rest. The tiles had another advantage. They were durable. Unlike hot water bottles, They couldn't leak or crack under repeated use. Even broken tiles found in storage sheds or damaged rooftops could be repurposed for this task. Of course, the method had its risks. Tiles had to be wrapped well to avoid burns, and care was needed when handling them directly from the oven. But, with practice, families treated them as essential winter companions. In some villages, this became a nightly ritual. Children fetched the cooled but still warm tiles before bed. Elders checked the wrappings and distributed them to each bed in the house. It was a small act, but it turned biting cold into manageable discomfort. Today, with modern heating, the idea of using clay tiles for warmth sounds almost primitive. Yet, during the war, it was a clever way to store heat from one task and apply it to another. No waste, no extra cost. It's a reminder that survival often comes from rethinking the tools already at hand, not from waiting for something new. Would you carry the warmth of the day into the coldest night? Subscribe, and keep the skills that turn routine into resilience. Number 3, compressed peat brick fires. In regions without steady access to wood or coal, during World War II, peat became a vital source of winter fuel. Peat, the dense, partially decayed plant matter found in bogs, could be dug, shaped, and dried into bricks that burned slow and steady. Harvesting peat was labor-intensive, but required no industrial tools. Families and small communities used simple spades to cut blocks from peat bogs in late spring or early summer. Each block was stacked in open air, sometimes for weeks until the moisture had evaporated. If stored properly under a roof or in a shed, these bricks could last through the harshest winters without rotting. During cold months, a single peat brick placed in a stove or hearth burned longer than many kinds of wood. Its heat output wasn't as intense as coal, but it provided a steady, enduring warmth, ideal for keeping a room comfortable overnight. In some homes, peat was mixed with scraps of wood or even dried crop stalks to improve the burn and conserve higher value fuel. The advantage was independence. Peat didn't have to be rationed or purchased from a supplier. It came from the land itself, available to anyone willing to put in the work months before the first frost. For rural families far from rail lines or ration depots, this meant heating security when others were left waiting for deliveries. However, peat had limits. It took time and labor to prepare, and the harvest could only be done in dry seasons. Frozen or waterlogged bogs were impossible to work. Its smoky burn also required good ventilation, especially in small rooms. Despite these challenges, compressed peat bricks became a symbol of self-reliance in fuel-poor areas. They were stacked neatly beside cottages, a visual guarantee that winter nights would be bearable. Neighbors often traded extra bricks for food or other goods, weaving peat into the informal barter economy of the time. Today, in some rural corners of Europe, peat harvesting is still practiced, though often for tradition rather than necessity. But during the war, it was nothing less than a lifeline, a fire pulled from the earth itself, shaped by hand, and kept for the moment it was most needed. Would you prepare your winter fuel months before the cold arrives? Number 4, kerosene-soaked rag lamps. When blackout orders darkened streets and homes during World War II, electric lighting could not be relied upon. In many rural and wartime affected areas, even oil lamps became scarce, as imports were restricted and glass chimneys broke without replacement. Families turned to an improvised solution that provided both light and a measure of heat: kerosene-soaked rag lamps. The method was simple but ingenious. An empty tin, often from preserved food, was cleaned and partially filled with kerosene. A strip of cotton cloth, torn from worn-out shirts or bed linens, was twisted tightly to form a crude wick. One end was anchored in the fuel, while the other extended just above the rim of the tin. When lit, the wick produced a steady, low flame that cast enough light to work, read, or cook by. Placed carefully in the center of a small room, the lamp's heat could also take the edge off the cold, especially in spaces sealed against drafts. Some families added stones or sand to the tin before pouring in kerosene, which reduced fuel use and stabilized the base. Others placed a small sheet of metal or clay tile behind the lamp to reflect light and heat forward. These small adaptations made the lamp more efficient and safer to handle. The biggest advantage was accessibility. Kerosene was still available in some markets, and tins and cloth were everywhere. Even without a proper lamp chimney, the device could be made in minutes from scraps most households already had. Its drawbacks were clear. The open flame demanded constant attention, and ventilation was essential to prevent buildup of fumes. Children and pets had to be kept at a safe distance, and the lamp could not be left burning unattended. Still, for thousands of households, this was the only evening light source through long winters. It made sewing, mending clothes, and preparing meals after dark possible without wasting precious wood or coal in the stove. Today, we take for granted that light and warmth come with the flip of a switch. During the war, they often came from a tin, a rag, and the careful use of every drop of fuel. It's a reminder that when systems fail, the ability to create your own light and warmth, even from scraps, is worth more than the most modern gadget. Would you know how to light your home when the grid goes dark? Number 5. Charcoal dust foot cushions. In the bitter winters of World War II, staying warm was about more than heating rooms. It was about protecting the body itself from cold damage. For those working long hours outdoors, keeping feet warm and dry was critical. Once boots became damp and temperatures dropped, frostbite risk increased sharply. One little-known trick emerged in farming villages and industrial towns alike: the use of charcoal dust foot cushions. Charcoal was already valued for cooking and heating, but its fine powder, often swept up from the bottom of storage bins, was just as useful. The process was simple. Worn-out socks were repurposed into small pouches, each filled with a layer of fine charcoal dust. The open ends were stitched shut or tied securely with string. These pouches were then slipped into boots or shoes beneath the soles of the feet. Charcoal's natural properties made it ideal for the task. It absorbed moisture, preventing sweat from chilling the skin, and it trapped warmth, keeping feet noticeably warmer during long hours outside. Because charcoal was lightweight, it added little burden to the wearer, yet it provided insulation far greater than a single extra sock could manage. Workers in railway yards, lumber camps, and open markets relied on them. Soldiers, returning on leave, sometimes brought the idea home, where it quickly spread among civilians facing their own winter struggles. In areas with limited access to charcoal, people substituted dried peat ash or even scorched grain husks, though these were less effective. The method had its limits. The pouches needed to be replaced or dried regularly, as prolonged dampness reduced their insulating ability. Charcoal dust could also stain fabric, so careful wrapping was necessary to avoid mess. Despite these minor drawbacks, charcoal dust foot cushions became a quiet but essential defense against winter's bite. They extended the time people could work outdoors, reduced the need for costly fuel breaks, and made rationed footwear last longer by keeping it drier inside. Today, the idea survives in modern thermal insoles and chemical warmers, but these require manufacturing and supply chains. In wartime, the same effect came from a sweep of the hearth, a scrap of cloth, and a few minutes of stitching. It was yet another reminder that survival often depends on noticing the dust at the bottom of a barrel, the fabric too worn for mending, and turning it into something that protects life when the cold closes in. Would you keep walking when winter tries to stop you? Number 6. Boiled linseed oil. Window seals. During World War II, one of winter's greatest enemies wasn't the cold outside. It was the cold creeping in through every crack and seam of a home. Fuel was too precious to waste on heating air that would escape through loose window frames. Families needed a way to block drafts without expensive materials or specialized tools. In some rural areas, craftsmen and farmers turned to a resource they already knew well: boiled linseed oil. Normally used to preserve wood and protect tools from moisture, it became a vital ingredient for homemade window seals. The method began with strips of cloth often cut from worn-out shirts, bed linens, or flour sacks. These strips were soaked thoroughly in boiled linseed oil, then wrung out just enough to handle. Once pliable and coated, they were pressed into the narrow gaps where window frames met walls. As the oil dried, the cloth stiffened slightly and bonded to the wood, creating a surprisingly effective airtight seal. The treatment also made the cloth water-resistant, so it didn't freeze solid or rot from condensation. Unlike plain rags or paper stuffing, these seals could last the entire winter without pulling loose. This trick worked particularly well in older houses where wood had shrunk and shifted over decades. Some households even applied it to door frames, sealing off rarely used rooms entirely to conserve heat in living areas. The supplies were easy to source. Linseed oil was still available in hardware shops, as it was considered essential for farm and maintenance work. Cloth was everywhere, and wartime rationing encouraged reusing every scrap. There were precautions, of course. Freshly soaked cloth was flammable, so it had to be kept away from open flames until fully dried. Ventilation during application was also important, as boiled linseed oil gave off a strong smell while curing. Despite these minor issues, the method spread quietly through villages and neighborhoods. By sealing out drafts, families reduced their fuel consumption, making small coal or wood piles last much longer. It was a perfect example of a low-cost, high-impact solution that came not from new inventions, but from applying existing knowledge in a new way. Today, most people reach for manufactured foam strips or plastic insulation kits. Yet this wartime adaptation required nothing more than oil, cloth, and patience, and it worked. Would you seal your home with what's already in your hands? Number 7. Stone bread. Heat retainers. In wartime villages, the communal bread oven was more than a place to bake food. It was the beating heart of the community. Once the day's baking was done, the oven's thick stone walls still radiated a deep, steady warmth. Rather than let that heat fade, families found a way to carry it home. Large, flat stones, sometimes the same ones used as baking surfaces for bread, were heated inside the oven after the last loaves were removed. These stones absorbed hours of heat, storing it like a natural battery. Once hot, they were lifted carefully with cloths or wooden paddles, then wrapped in thick rags or layers of straw. The wrapped stones were carried back to homes, where they served as makeshift heaters. Placed under beds, beside chairs, or in the center of small rooms, they released a gentle warmth for hours into the night. In homes without stoves running constantly, this made the difference between shivering and sleeping in comfort. The practice became especially valuable in harsh winters when fuel was scarce. Because the bread oven was already heated for cooking, no additional fuel was burned solely for the stones. It was a perfect use of residual energy. Families often had a set of heat stones reserved just for this purpose. Some even carved initials into them to avoid mixing theirs with neighbors' stones in the communal oven. In areas with no communal oven, smaller versions of the method were done at home, using stones heated beside cooking fires. The method had to be handled with care. Unwrapped stones could cause burns, and if placed on damp floors, they could crack from sudden temperature changes. Still, with careful handling, they could last for years without replacement. It was a system born of necessity, but refined into tradition. Children often remembered the evening walk home from the oven, carrying warm bundles through the snow, knowing they would make the night more bearable. Today, the idea seems almost forgotten, replaced by electric heaters and insulated bottles. Yet, during the war, it was proof that survival often meant looking at everyday tools, in this case, the humble stone, and asking, what else can this do? Would you carry the heat of the day into the coldest night? Number 8. Hot grain sack sleeping warmers. In the long winters of World War II, a warm bed could mean the difference between a night of rest and a night of shivering. When fuel was rationed and stoves couldn't be kept burning through the night, families turned to creative ways of storing and carrying heat into sleeping hours. One of the most effective, and least remembered, was the hot grain sack sleeping warmer. The method was born out of necessity in farming regions. Wheat, rye, and barley were stored in heavy cloth sacks, sturdy enough to carry hundreds of pounds. When grain was needed for milling or cooking, families would scoop smaller amounts into worn-out sacks or pillowcases, repurposing them for heating. The process began in the evening. A portion of dry grain, usually wheat or rye, was placed in a clean, tightly woven sack. The sack was then set near, but not directly on, the stove or oven, where the radiant heat warmed the kernels evenly. Some households used a baking tray to gently heat the grain in the oven after cooking, stirring it occasionally to avoid scorching. Once warmed, the grain-filled sack was wrapped in layers of cloth to hold in the heat. Placed under bed covers or at the foot of the bed, it released warmth for hours, often until morning. The dense grain held heat far longer than hot water bottles, and unlike ceramic or glass containers, it couldn't crack or leak. The beauty of this method was its double use. The grain inside the sack could be cooled and returned to storage the next day, ready for cooking or heating again. Nothing was wasted. The same kernels might cycle through dozens of warming nights before they were eaten. In some households, multiple small sacks were made so each person could have their own. Children especially benefited from the comfort, often falling asleep faster when their feet rested against the soft, warm bundle. For the elderly, it reduced the chill in unheated rooms and helped prevent cold-related ailments. Of course, there were limits. The sacks had to be kept dry at all times to prevent spoilage, and care was needed not to overheat the grain, which could damage its flavor. But these were minor concerns compared to the comfort they brought. Today, the idea survives in a modern form: microwavable grain pillows. But in the war years, it was a lifeline improvised from what every farm already had. It proved that with a little preparation, the same harvest that fed the family could also keep them warm through the coldest nights. Would you turn your harvest into heat when winter closed in? Subscribe and hold on to the skills that make every resource work twice. In the winters of the Second World War, warmth was never taken for granted. It wasn't something that arrived with the turn of a dial. It was earned through resourcefulness, patience, and the clever use of whatever the season allowed. Families who survived did so by transforming waste into fuel, turning the day's labor into the night's comfort, and carrying heat in forms most of us would never think of today. Every sack of grain, every stone, every scrap of cloth had more than one purpose. Nothing was simply thrown away. These were not luxuries. They were lifelines. Shaped by hands that understood scarcity, adapted to hardship, and refused to surrender to the cold, our world now runs on systems that feel permanent. But history tells a different story. Those systems can falter, and when they do, survival belongs to those who can act without them. The question is, when that moment comes, will you be ready? If you believe knowledge like this should never be forgotten, if you want the skills that kept families alive when the world froze around them, then stay with us, because what's coming next could prepare you for the winter no one expects. Subscribe now, and carry the warmth of history into your future.